and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to Chapter 3 of Charles Williams' The Place of the Lion. Chapter 3 being called The Coming of the Butterflies, because there are butterflies involved. Also, you ever wonder why Damaris comes off as such a bitch? Well, it turns out it's because she has to be one. I hate this chapter. Thanks. I hate it. Butterfly part is pretty neat, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with a summary first, and then I will get to ranting. Warnings ahead. Probably a lot of rude language. Anthony deserves it. So, what happens in The Coming of the Butterflies? Well, we begin the chapter with the apparently well-worn argument between Damaris and Anthony about marriage. Damaris isn't really interested. She doesn't think they'd make a really good married couple, and of course she wants to complete her PhD. Anthony is sort of insistent, in the worst way. Like, you're a terrible person, Damaris, and I'm the only person that's ever gonna recognize you and love you anyways. Way. Whew. There seems to be some mild attraction between the two of them, and when they do start getting closer together, a bad smell permeates the air. Damaris actually recognizes it from what she smelled the previous night in the house with the crowned snake. So it's kind of a mood killer, if the mood wasn't already dead and gone. But mood killer nonetheless, and Anthony, despite insisting it's probably her pipes, decides to leave. He's got some work to do, and she's going to take a bath because she's kind of wondering if the smell has attached itself to her hair. Anthony leaves and ponders both Damaris' childishness and the lioness. And ultimately he ends up wandering off down the road back to the house where he saw the lioness disappear and the lion appear. And up in front of the house is Mr. Ty, Damaris' father, the butterfly enthusiast, and a stranger Anthony does not recognize. This stranger actually hops in his car and disappears, so Anthony only ends up talking with Mr. Ty. They speak briefly about the human impact on the world, and then things go bonkers. Absolutely bonkers. Quite suddenly, a massive butterfly appears in the middle of the garden, about the same place that the lion appeared 2 nights before, and just thousands of butterflies start swarming the area. This massive butterfly floats up to meet them, falls down with all of them, and the smaller butterflies seem to vanish, allowing the singular massive butterfly to continue this dance, making more and more butterflies vanish, until ultimately it's the only butterfly left. It lands briefly on the house and then flies off. Anthony is a little stunned and confused, while Mr. Ty is in absolute rapture of this moment. He seems to think that he is finally connected with something that he has long known and believed in, but didn't think he would ever visually get to see. He calls it the power and the glory, which you might recognize as a very biblical sense of the power and glory of God. Anthony is kind of like, can you explain what just happened? And Mr. Ty fully admits that he can't. If you didn't see it, I can't tell you what you didn't see. They walk off a bit together, but end up parting ways. Anthony says he needs to really think about all of this, though he's mostly still thinking about Damaris. And Mr. Ty reports that he is going to go look at his butterfly collection and recount to himself everything he has just perceived, because it is true. Thanks, I hate it. That's a bit of a lie, because I find the second half of this chapter absolutely fascinating. Like, the discussion about human effect on the world and the butterfly. The first chapter, though, like, every bad thought you have about Damaris as being the worst type of academic that you had in your head the previous chapter. You hit the start of this one and you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. Because suddenly Damaris becomes recharacterized. And not necessarily in the way Anthony is perceiving her. Anthony becomes one of sort of our big character point of views, as does Damaris. And I don't know if Charles Williams meant for us to relate a lot to Anthony more than Damaris, and I don't know if my own position as a woman in academia affects my opinion. I didn't like Damaris in Chapter 2, because she does come off as this haughty person who is deigning to explain some great things she's realized to complete imbeciles that have no idea what they're doing. How dare they interrupt her? And then you have the conversation with Anthony. And suddenly, this is a mindset that Damaris has adopted because no one else will listen to her otherwise. Like, Anthony just is an absolute bastard in these scenes. Like, he's an asshole in the worst way possible. You want me to prove it? Okay, let's... First and foremost, the sheer number of times he interrupts her. Like, just constantly interrupting her. Now, she does sometimes interrupt him, but you really get the sense it's because she's trying to finish what she was saying. So let's go to the very start of what we're given of the very start of the chapter. Anthony shook his head reproachfully at Damaris over the coffee cups. You know, he said, if I were sub-editor on anything but a distinguished literary paper, I should say you were playing with me, playing fast and loose. Don't be absurd, Anthony Damaris answered. I come and I go, Anthony went on, and you will and you won't, but I've told you what I will, Damaris said. I'm not sure whether you and I can make a success of marriage, and anyhow, I won't think of anything of the kind till I've got my degree. Of course, if you think more of yourself than of me, well, naturally I do, Anthony interrupted. Who doesn't? Am I a sate and Alexandrian Gnostic? Don't let's ask rhetorical questions, darling. I'm not doing anything of the kind, Damaris said coldly, but you must be willing to wait a little while. I'm not sure of myself. It's all you are sure of. Besides, Abelard, Anthony said, and with you that covers everything else. I think you're rather unkind, Damaris answered. We both like each other. Dearest, I don't like you a bit, Anthony interrupted again. I think you're very detestable, selfish pig and prig. But I'm often wildly in love with you, and so I see you're not. But I'm sure your only chance of salvation is to marry me. Really, Anthony, Damaris got up from the table. Chance of salvation indeed. And from what should I like to know? Nobody else, Anthony went on, sees you as you are. Nobody else would give you such a difficult and unpleasant time as I do. You'll never be comfortable, but you may be glorious. You'd better think it over. So you're thinking to yourself here, holy shit. What? And it kind of gets worse, because Damaris is distinctly aware of this, because this follows immediately. Damaris said nothing. Anthony, it was clear, was in one of his difficult fits. If it hadn't been for the two camps... So Damaris is well aware that this is part of Anthony's personality. Now, she does seem to be trying to narrow it down. She says it's one of his difficult fits. But she also kind of has to admit that she has to put up with him. If it wasn't for the two camps, is what she thinks to herself. Meaning, if he wasn't the sub-editor for the two camps, she would not put up with this absolute bullshit. And a lot of women, not even just in academia, I mean a lot of women everywhere have run into this precise problem. Which is, if you don't put up with, again, not all men, but men, it's usually men, especially men in positions of power over you. If you don't put up with the bullshit, then you're kicked out. You're not going to rise through the ranks. You're going to get nowhere. And that's actually kind of terrifying. And so suddenly both sides of Damaris become recognizable as personas that a lot of women in academia and business are going to recognize, because it's the two they have to have that's going to get them someplace. And that is the cold-hearted bitch who knows she's right and will fight for it because it's the only way to get anybody to listen to her. And I'm not going to say the meek, mild person, but the person who has to curb what they're thinking versus what they say, and curb their reaction to unpleasant people to keep their position. And sometimes those are going to seem like wildly different, but it's kind of what you have to do. Like, you have to be able to dig in your heels and take people thinking of you as a cold-hearted bitch because you need to be listened to. You have a game plan. Somebody needs to stop interrupting you and listen. And that is going to affect how a lot of people look at you, even if you're a great person outside of work hours. It's because they're not going to listen otherwise. So if you don't fight for yourself, no one's going to fight for you. But there's also the other side, which is choosing when not to fight and just putting up with, like I said, absolute bullshit coming your way, because that's the other technique that's going to get you someplace. And it's absolutely terrifying that this is how the system works. And, like, you're kind of looking at it going, how am I supposed to follow Anthony after this point? Because the rest of the chapter, despite the absolutely just mind-boggling moment of the coming of the butterflies that happens, Anthony is just so fixated on Damaris as this image of a girl that he has, that you're just kind of like, oh, end me, like, get out. Amazing things are happening, and you're still an asshole who can't see Damaris as a three-dimensional person. Well, that's what's really frustrating about Anthony here, is that when I say he can't see Damaris as a three-dimensional person, it's because he thinks himself the only person who does perceive her in that way. He thinks he's the only person who sees the truth about her, and thus is the only one that can really love Damaris. And it's so gross feeling. Like, when he says you might not be comfortable, but you will be glorious, like, that is somebody who's well aware that he is in a position of power and is holding it over Damaris. And you're kind of like, get out. Get out. This isn't good. This isn't how to perceive people. But in a lot of ways, it does explain Anthony's attraction to the forms that we've already seen. Because it's not this complete envelopment that we've seen with two other people. Mr. Berenger, it's not so clear, but he's been so enveloped by the lion that he doesn't seem to have any humanness to him anymore. Even his body doesn't act in a human way. It's affected by this gravitational pull of the lion. And Mr. Tai seems to perceive the butterflies in this moment as something holy that he has always known and believed in, but never gotten the chance to see, and that suddenly manifests, and his eyes are just wide open in this moment. Anthony has perceived the coming of these two forms, and is mildly attracted to them, but also detached in a way. So how does this explain his image of Damaris? It's probably a human flaw, and Anthony does say this to Damaris, which is when she says, if you think you're better than me, and he says, of course I do. We all do. Meaning, we always have to have this idea of ourselves being worth something to continue to exist in the world. And to fight for what we want. Like, Damaris has to think that she has ideas worth fighting for, and even if that makes her come across as really arrogant and rude, that's what she has to do, right? Same with Anthony. Anthony's saying the exact same thing. He's gotta fight for this relationship because he deserves it. And you see the problem here, right? Which is there needs to be a balance between the two, or you're gonna come off in really poor ways. Like, Damaris still comes off as a bitch and sort of ungrateful for the opportunity she has with this group. Anthony comes across as an absolute bastard and asshole. So there needs to be a balance between your own worth and the worth of those around you. And oftentimes, this seems to be the idea that you and the people around you make each other better. So you would not be nearly as good if you didn't have those important people around you, right? In fact, that's what self-help usually talks about when they say you should remove toxic people. If someone is your type of Anthony, if they're telling you no one's ever going to love you because no one's ever going to look at you the way I do, no one's ever going to see you the way I do, you secretly love when we fight, that's not making you better in a good way. We should be making each other better. Me and my best friend Rach make each other better. Because we talk about things and we're able to tell each other when we're feeling upset and how we perceive things and self-reflect, and we help make each other better. And this is something that Aristotle at least speaks rather directly about with the most powerful type of friendship. But we're not going to get into that. The other type of perception we have happening here, though, is the creation of the forms. Which is to say that there is one single perfect form of something, and everything else is an imperfect, to the point where some of it's ugly copies, right? The butterfly subsumes all the other butterflies into it because for the perfect thing to exist, none of these imperfect versions can. And we're told when they disappear from the world and knowledge. And suddenly there is only the perfect butterfly. There is a concern then, having paired this butterfly scene up with this discussion with Damaris, of whether or not Anthony is perceiving the forms because he has this idea in and of himself. Which is humans, and singular humans, absorb everything else into them to create the perfect form of themselves. Which is very different from you and the people around you make each other better. Because with the creation of the forms, well, the other things disappear, right? And they discuss that between Mr. Tai and Anthony before the appearance of the butterfly. Because Mr. Tai says that it will be a terrible thing to have lost everything that comes before humanity, because humanity just insists on subsuming everything. Humanity just goes through the world and eats and eats and eats and takes and takes and takes and consumes and consumes and consumes. And Anthony is a singular feature of this, who is so unaware of himself that he has convinced himself that Damaris is in fact the image of this. Because he insists the only thing Damaris knows is Abelard and herself. Now, Damaris fights this. She actually says she's not sure of herself. She's not sure this is a good relationship. She is sure she would like to finish her degree, but she's not sure of who she is yet. That's why she wants to finish her degree. Her trying to set ground rules here comes across to Anthony as her trying to be the form and not a singular person. But Anthony refusing to listen to these ground rules and having that idea, well, it's the same thing. He's trying to become the form here. He is the saving grace for Damaris, the salvation of Damaris, by being subsumed into him. And it's a question of how we should feel about that. Are we meant to be in awe of the forms as they enter the world, or are we meant to face some sort of sadness in the fact that all those other butterflies are now gone? Mr. Tai seems to think that we should be celebrating this moment, because he seems to perceive what has happened in a very religious way. But I hate to say it, that's also a common human feature. When you lose something deeply important to you, oftentimes another person, finding comfort in a religious understanding, or a pseudo-religious understanding. I'm not saying it has to be like Christianity, or Islam, or Judaism. It can be a pseudo-religious one. For example, a lot of people find comfort in the scientific fact that matter is not created or destroyed. It simply changes. Well, that, as a comfort thing, can be perceived as pseudo-religious, because the loss that you suffered isn't really a loss. That person who's no longer here is simply something else. And it is a comfort we often want to face. We don't want to perceive the end of something, but being subsumed into something greater. The problem is when it's the perfect form versus the imperfect form. And I think that's the important difference. If we are to understand the entrance of these forms into the world as a positive, then we have to recognize that they are the perfect form, and they've subsumed all the imperfect forms. We can then think that the butterfly is a good thing, and recognize that Damaris and Anthony's relationship with each other is not good, because both of them aren't the actual form. They're imperfect people that, at least in each other's eyes, are trying to subsume the other person and not recognize them as an individual. When you yourself are imperfect, then subsuming other people, not an option. If you are in fact the form of the thing, you're not human. To finish up, what I am trying to say is that as humans, we are not the platonic perfect form of anything. None of the platonic forms are going to show up in human form. They might combine with humans, which we saw with Mr. Berenger, but Mr. Berenger, like I said, doesn't seem to be human anymore. So, if you have a relationship, trying to subsume the other person because you're better than them isn't going to get you anywhere. It's just going to make the relationship toxic. You are not the butterfly that all the other butterflies flock to. Try and help other people be better while also trying to be better yourself. Don't be Anthony. And if you're Damaris with an Anthony, you deserve better. Even if we're all imperfect. So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time. Perfect forms of anything. Cat just punched me in the throat.